thinking that you're not going to be involved in disability is probably a bit naive, because we're all going to experience some kind of disability in our lifetime.
My name is Ben Charland. You're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Helen Ries, an advocate and stakeholder engagement specialist based in Ottawa, Ontario. Helen is the co-founder of the Sibling Collaborative, a national family support network for individuals who care for and support their siblings with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Helen's brother Paul has Down syndrome, and Helen is his caregiver and, of course, his sister. How those two things are interlinked is a lot about what this conversation focuses on. We talk about disability as a whole. We talk about the importance of building caring and supportive communities across the country and around the world. We talk about institutionalization and how deinstitutionalizing people, not just with disabilities, but those in the prison system, for example, is so important and how it can be done. We speak about the generational shift as parents of disabled people today are aging and have to move on. What do we do next? There are many more aspects of this conversation, such as the connection between disability and poverty, and of course, public policy. It's a fascinating conversation. I hope you take the time not just to listen, but to let me know what you think of this episode. Go to whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes. Let me know what you think of them. Get in touch with me on social media or by email. And at the website, you can find the show notes for this episode, which is important because we're referencing all of the things that we talk about, but don't have time to give you the link for or the video for. There's actually some links on there that Helen provided after the episode about some of the things that we discussed. And at whatonearthisgoingon.ca, you can find a link to Apple Podcasts, where you can give us a rating and a review. Let us know what you think of this episode and of this show. If you like this podcast, please take the time to do so. It helps a huge deal. Finally, and as always, reach out and let me know what on earth you think is going on. All right, Helen Ries, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ben. Thank you.
I'm really excited to chat with you, and excited also to be in this beautiful home that you have in Ottawa, Ontario.
Thank you.
It's a very welcoming space.
Great.
And I feel welcomed, and it's kind of the space that kind of facilitates conversation. It's big, it's open, and hopefully the kind of conversation we're going to have today about disability, among other things. Mm-hmm. In this home, you live with your brother who has Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. It's something you've written about quite a bit in the past and talked about and dealt with both as a writer but also as a consultant. Mm-hmm. And you've been active in this space for some time. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you the big question, what on earth is going on, in a moment. But before I do, I just wanted to ask you what your work specifically involves in Ottawa. What do you do from day to day? What as you know, you have a company called Helen Ries Consulting, and you work with different groups. But what does it involve specifically, and what are you trying to achieve?
Ooh, well, I have a lot of different kinds of work. So I do a lot of social research and program evaluation and facilitation, usually with organizations that work with vulnerable populations. So
right.
I'm, for example, I'll work with people who are justice involved, people who are working with folks who are on the autism spectrum. So I support them in the programs that they're trying to create better lives for these vulnerable populations in Ottawa.
What is justice involved? Is that people who are involved in the justice system,
Yes.
going through the justice system?
Yes.
Interesting.
Which entails, by the way, many people who have disabilities.
That's what I figured, yeah.
Yes.
I had a really interesting conversation on this podcast with Senator Kim Pate, who has worked a lot in that space with people who are essentially just in the prison system in Canada, and how to improve our prison system, because it's quite backward in many ways, and we're missing, especially women and people with disabilities, people who are marginalized in that system, and it's not good for our society. I mean, talking about the individual and individual rights is one thing, but we can also talk about how this just isn't good for all of us. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's an analogy here to our conversation, where treating the way we deal with people with disabilities is a reflection on how we deal with anybody in our society. Mm-hmm. It's almost a kind of a baseline for how we function and how we operate. And it's very important to me personally, but I think it's also very important for us to build a better world and a better society.
Exactly.
It seems like that's the kind of work that you do.
That's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I'm also working in the caregiving space. So we have, you talked about prisons, and what came to mind for me is institutionalization. So we have in the last few years, I guess in the last 20 years, when working on deinstitutionalizing, anyway, here in Ontario, people from places like Rideau Regional and Huronia, and the prison system is just another form of institutionalization. So when people come out of institution, the reintegration into society is the key piece that needs to be done well, so that people belong, so that people don't end up back institutionalized, like coming from a mental health or an institution for people with developmental disabilities, and then ending up in a prison system or in the shelter system or in the people are just hopping from institution to institution.
Right.
Or I shouldn't say people generally, but they can hop from institution to institution.
And it becomes a sort of unsustainable and dark path for many people when you're no longer on your own feet. You're just in the care of the state, which often doesn't care very much.
The state doesn't care.
Right.
And when you have new governments that come in, and it seems like their first line of attack is always the social services system. So we're going to cut money from people with developmental disabilities, usually because the perception is that they have no economic and no political power, and also it's an ableist perspective that because you are disabled, you are undeserving. So we're going to cut from there. Who ends up bearing the brunt of that is, of course, the people with disabilities, but also the families who need to pick up the pieces. And that's what families have been doing for many years.
It's interesting because governments often get away with that because they appeal to people who aren't in those positions. They're appealing to people both who are not disabled, but also to people who maybe don't know anybody who's disabled. And I read a quote the other day, and I'm just paraphrasing it, which said that privilege is the ability to look at someone who is suffering and say, it doesn't matter because it doesn't affect me personally.
Exactly.
And I think that if I'm a voter, whether in Ontario or Canada or anywhere really, the disability thing isn't really mattering, doesn't matter to me, so why would I bother voting for it? They're going to cut that social program. Well, what does it matter to me? Let the people who it will affect vote for that. Well, it affects all of us in the end.
Well, it does really affect all of us. And I think thinking that there's no economic or political power is really not really understanding. I mean, if you include physical disabilities, people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the world. And when you consider the money that is in disability, whether it's for supports, for services, for money that families are trying to save for their loved one. I mean, it is an economic power. And I don't understand why governments don't try to think more innovatively around disability. So rather than looking at it through an austerity lens, or why can't they look with the lens of innovation and look at this body of people and what the potential is, and try and harness some of that power?
So what do you mean by that? Like, can you dig into that, what you mean by innovation? Because I think I understand, and I'm not asking you necessarily to innovate right now, to come up with some new idea, but what are we talking about?
Well, a couple of years ago, I worked on an initiative here in Ontario to try and change the gifts and assets limit for Ontario disability support. So families may have, not all families, but some families may have some money. For example, if a person's parents have passed away and they have an inheritance, and so they can possibly use that money towards their good life. However, there were all these restrictions around ODSP where that's not possible.
And
to use.
ODSP is the money you might, if you have a severe disability, you get money from the government.
Right. It's a baseline amount, and it's a very minimal. So it's at or just below the rate of poverty, and it does not increase with the rate of inflation, or it has not increased with the rate of inflation, and so you can't live on that amount of money, especially without access to affordable housing.
Right, and all provinces have a different version of this. I come from
Exactly.
Alberta, and it's called AISH, AISH
Exactly.
in Alberta, and it's never a lot of money, but it's some. And you're saying that there's a restriction based on the gifts and assets. Yeah.
Yeah. So we worked with the former government, and they had an income security working group as well, to try and raise those gifts and assets limits. And so we tried to get the gifts to be unlimited. And even the fact that it's called gifts is highly obnoxious. I mean, it's not a gift that you're giving someone when you're trying to eke them out of poverty, and then assets, what people could hold. So we tried to change it from up to unlimited gifts. I think it was $5,000 or $6,000 that they could get a year, to unlimited, and then assets. We moved it up. We wanted $100,000, being able to hold $100,000 in assets, but we got it up to $40,000 in assets. But if you think about a person, let's say with Down syndrome or an other intellectual disability, and their parents have passed away, and they inherit, if they're lucky, if their parents were able, they can inherit some money and maybe a house. Like, how are you supposed to maintain a house on $5,000 or whatever the asset limit was, or the gift limit? We need to be able to. The innovation is being able to support people to support themselves with whatever that they have to be able to do that.
Right.
And even looking at ideas like the child tax benefit or the old age security, why can't people with profound disabilities have access to something like that?
Right.
Again, I think it comes to that ableist mentality that you are disabled, therefore you don't deserve, which is so different from how we see people who are seniors or children.
Absolutely, yeah. It sounds like these are attractive solutions for probably both sides of the aisle, if only because they don't necessarily cost anything extra for the state. Like, I think when we talk about innovative solutions, we're talking about, all right, maybe we can't get a bucket of new funding, but we can work with the parameters that already exist in the state and in law and in legislation, and make a policy shift just to make things easier for people who are either caregivers or who have disabilities themselves.
Right.
I
mean, there's always risks too, right? Because then, are you making a two-tiered system inside, or are you separating out two groups of people inside the disability under the disability umbrella? Those who have family members who are able to give, and those who don't. So it becomes it can become quite difficult. But I mean, it's happening now anyway, right? So people, my brother lives with me because we have space for him to live here, and so he lives in. In your intro, you said it's a nice house. Thank you. And he lives in a nice space. He doesn't have to live in a basement apartment somewhere.
Sure.
So it happens already, where families, but what kind of pressure would it release if people were able to be lifted out of poverty? And the interesting thing, we started our conversation around the justice system. And I always wonder, when governments like the one that we have in Ontario now go after the jugular of the disability community, I wonder, where do they think that those people are going to go? If you're not going to sink money into the disability sector, then you better be ready to sink that money into the shelter system, into the criminal justice system, into the mental health system, into our healthcare sector, because that's where those people are going to go. It's not like by cutting away, you're going to get rid of those people.
Well, and I think this conversation sort of belies one of the problems of government, which is that, or politics actually, which is that I'm going to argue to take away funding from this and everyone's going to love it because I'm cutting costs. The secret, of course, that I know is true is that I'm not actually cutting any costs. I'm just moving the costs over to a different area. But if I don't tell anybody that, I'm still the hero, even though I know I haven't actually achieved anything. I've just moved things over. I mean, we can talk about almost any policy when it comes to healthcare or social services. You're just moving costs around.
Exactly.
You're just asking something else to bear the burden, and eventually the state's going to have to pick up the bill anyways. But when we talk about, but we're just abstracting the complexity. We're just taking something that seems simple in everyone's mind. Oh yeah, why are we paying money to people that I have nothing to do with?
Right.
Well, the state will still have to pay for it.
Yeah. It's like the inability to conceive that issues are intersectional, right? Like that there are multiple facets that belong to any kind of issue.
But the troubling part is that it takes time and patience and conversations like this in order to uncover that truth. And most people aren't willing to do that. And so I think politicians and governments can get away with that sort of abstraction and nuance to make sure that, it sounds good. Oh, looks like you did what I asked you to do.
Right. And you can always rely on the concept of institution to keep hidden away what people don't want to see. So you can take the people with disabilities, and they're hidden in the justice system, they're hidden in the shelter system, and they're hidden in the hospitals, and you don't have to see them day to day.
Well, and I think furthermore, people with disabilities are often just hidden in daily life. They're hidden because many people choose not to see them. Walking through the street, walking in the mall, wherever you are. I mean, it's. My mother was a woman with a disability. She was a quadriplegic for 40 years. And it was often, I'm going to say interesting, just because it was different, to see how people would react to her in a wheelchair, a woman in a wheelchair who had a disability, and how that sometimes made her overly visible, which wasn't comfortable, but then, of course, sometimes made her invisible, which also wasn't comfortable. And it's just, when something's uncomfortable, I'd rather just not deal with it. It's almost like if I think I might have something I should go to the hospital for, maybe I just will pretend it's not happening and it'll just magically go away. It's magical thinking, and it doesn't serve us. But it is one of the conditions, I think, of having a disability, is this conflict of visibility.
Well, I think that we're actually in a really exciting time where people with disabilities are being given a voice that they haven't necessarily been given. So we've always approached disability with a medical model. So a lot of times the history of people with disabilities has not been captured because they only have the medical reports or to create the story. But there are small grassroots movements that are trying to change that. So for example, there's a project called Memory, Witness, and Hope, which is capturing the stories of people who lived in the institutions here in Ontario by actually going out and talking to them and capturing their stories. And I'm even working on a grassroots project here in Ottawa called the Ottawa Adult Autism Initiative, where we're doing public consultations with members of the autistic community and creating surveys that have visuals, like really people are looking at ways to gather voices. And I think maybe we haven't had the patience to do that in the past, or maybe we haven't set that as the standard, that we should be interviewing people and talking to people who are actually have the lived experience. So, I mean, that's one of the things I talked to you about at the outset, is like, I don't have the lived experience of being a person with a disability, although I've had the great privilege and honor of walking very closely beside someone throughout a lifetime. And I feel I've learned a lot through my brother, and every day always am surprised and learn more.
One thing that's interesting about this episode so far is our conversation both about and around the idea of public policy and public spending, what this money is for, what it goes to, and how it has both economic and social benefits. Really, when we talk about disability, we're talking about the core purpose of the public sector. Now, coming up in this conversation, I ask Helen why she feels that she hasn't quite arrived with her work and may never do so, but that, in effect, is the whole ethos of what she's trying to do. That's all coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, right? Because there's a lot of things that obviously I talk about on this podcast that I have no personal lived experience in. And furthermore, I'm not an expert in any way whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've spoken to chemists and physicists and AI experts, and I don't know anything about this stuff. Mm-hmm. But the point is, I think, to have a dialogue about it. Mm-hmm. Dialogue can only be good. It can only include more and more over time. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that we're fighting against perhaps is monologue, when we just have one voice telling us what to think and feel, even if that's a doctor saying, this is what it means to be disabled. It's not like that doesn't offer us anything. It's just, it doesn't offer us enough. It's a narrow pathway. Mm-hmm. Helen, I wanted to ask you the big question. I don't want to get too far into this without giving you the opportunity. It's the title of the podcast, What on Earth is Going On? And it's an opportunity for us to whether branch out the conversation or focus the conversation, but kind of to arrest what's happening today in the world. And it's an urgent question, even if it's broad. What on earth is going on is what I'm getting at. And underneath that, of course, is why. Why is this happening? So you can take this anywhere you like, but Helen, what on earth is going on?
Well, what on earth is going on is a deepening crisis for people with developmental disabilities and their families in Ontario and, well, I would say in all of Canada. And the deepening crisis comes from what we just talked about, the lack of resources, financial resources, or access to a life outside of poverty, a life outside of institution, whatever that looks like. And then for families, there is the caregiving crisis. So we deinstitutionalize many people with the promise of better lives in the community and the promise that the money would follow for the life in the community, but that hasn't happened. So you have amazing people like my parents and their cohort who are now perhaps in their 80s or beyond, who fought the concept of institutionalization, who made visible, like we were saying earlier, their family member in the community. And those people are becoming too old to care, or like in our family, or I mean too old to provide care, or like what happened in our family is our parents have passed away. And so what does that mean for us now? We have more people with more disabilities living in community than ever before without the right support. And what's happening is that support is falling to these aging parents. And when they're no longer able, who does that go to? It goes most often to the sibling of the brother or sister with a developmental disability. And that's really quite complex.
Yeah, you wrote a really beautiful post actually about your mom on the 5th anniversary of when she passed away, and recognizing what a hero and powerful person she was for so long, for doing what she did, and how she must be representative of so many other people who care for their children, but then at some point become too old. And your mother died suddenly, according to that post. Some people have a longer term, longer transition, but whatever the case, you're actually talking about a demographic shift that's occurring in the Western world as a whole. And it's quite pronounced in some parts of Canada. And this is one of the impacts of it, and we're spending a lot on, just in terms of money, we're putting a lot of resources towards healthcare and caregiving because of this transition. It's one of the biggest growing sectors of our economy is caregiving and support, because there is this big transition that we haven't really considered yet. And it's now just happening bring to us. We don't have the labor for it. We don't have the money for it. We don't have the legislation and the policy for it.
Right.
And now, as a sibling, you're bearing the brunt of some of that, and you yourself are able to take an active role in maybe trying to take innovative solutions for this. But it is, I didn't recognize this until doing research for this conversation. It is a crisis.
It is a crisis. It really is. And I mean, my situation should never really be used as an example, because I believe I'm in a place of great privilege in that my brother and I are great friends. And we love each other, and we have a lot of fun. And my husband is open, and he loves Paul too. So that's a very special place. Not every family has that, or has the space to live together.
But can I just interrupt you and say quickly that what you just described may be special, but shouldn't be. It should be quite normal that you have a brother who you love and a husband who loves your brother, and we're all pretty happy. That sounds like it should be normal.
Right. So it should be normal. And actually, I say that like it's special, but the research actually shows that siblings of a person with a developmental disability do, in fact, mostly love, appreciate, and want to be involved in the lives of their brothers and sisters. So there's quite a lot of research around that. But I think one thing that's important to point out, so you talked about that podcast and how it was I was in memory of, or not podcast, that
the blog post, yeah.
Yeah, and it was in memory of my mother. And the reason I picked mother is because typically it has been mothers who stayed home from the workforce to care for their son or daughter with a developmental disability. And not to exclude all the fathers out there, but I mean, that's the way it typically was. And now what's happening is that role is actually transferring to sisters. So what you have between the mothers and the sisters, what you have is a cohort of gendered, unpaid, invisible people who are doing, or women who are doing this care. And that's also the gendered nature of this care work is also really concerning. And who is leading the disability movement? It has been for a long time a lot of able-bodied white men, and yet it's the women who have been in the church basements raising money with Rice Krispie squares or whatever they've been doing to establish the family movement. And so it's time for their voices, the sisters' voices, and also, of course, the voices of people with developmental disabilities to lead.
Do you see that is changing and that leadership is happening, or is it frustrating to watch that the stereotypes just continue to be reinforced?
No, I do see that it's changing. So I think my world is myopic. So, and I always optimistic. So maybe what I see is not the truth, but I do note that there are more women leading and more women's voices being heard.
Right. So if someone's listening to this episode and they don't know someone with a disability, they're not disabled themselves, they're not really connected to this. Mm-hmm. Is this just something that can be interesting to them and maybe that they should vote for when the election time comes? Or are there ways in which they can get involved and be part of this conversation, be part of this activism?
Well, thinking that you're not going to be involved in disability is probably a bit naive, because we're all going to experience some kind of disability in our lifetime. I mean, I broke my ankle 2 years ago, and so for a period of, I would say, a year, I was physically disabled by my broken ankle. And there's your own experience of disability, but also, I said at the outset that it's one of the largest minority group. It is the largest minority group in the world. And if you consider that each of those person has family members and friends, I mean, there's bound to be some kind of connection to disability. If it doesn't exist now, it might in the future. So it's not a isolated issue. It's an issue that will affect us all. The caregiving, the issue of caregiving, and especially the unprepared caregiver, somebody who suddenly has to become a caregiver, I think that's also something that you need to be cognizant of. Like, who's going to care for you when you have that a period of time of being disabled with your, broken ankle or
Right.
Alzheimer's or whatever is staring us in the face in the future.
What you're actually talking about then is that this is something deep in human nature, in the human condition.
Absolutely.
That this isn't, yeah.
And I think that's what's really interesting, is that there's a lot of othering around disability.
Right.
You just asked me a question related to that, that it belongs to outside of who I am, but
it can't be. It is who you are.
I think who we are.
And there's another aspect to this too, which is kind of parallel to what we're talking about, which is that I can talk about disabled people as if they are different than I am, and I can talk about the disability community as if it's one of many other communities.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so much more nuanced than that, and disability is not just a black or white. It's not an on-off switch.
Right.
It is something that is part of all of us. It's on the spectrum. It's something that is part of the larger human experience. Maybe I may not encounter the kind of disability that, say, your brother might have until I'm much, much older, or until a family member gets into a car accident, or any number of things happen to me or to someone that I know, or I encounter someone. But also, because it's such a large group of people who would fit into this description, I mean, it's not hard for me to encounter them in my day-to-day life. The fact that I'm not is perhaps the issue. And I think that we're, by seeing it in these terms of, well, there's this group and I'm not part of this group, is not only inaccurate, but it's actually exacerbating the problems that we're talking about.
Exactly. It creates a divide where there is none.
There's a lot to be learned from this, not just about policy and politics and government, but also about ourselves. I think there's a lot of personal discovery in this. And I wonder, in your journey throughout this work, I mean, you've been involved in this space since, I think, 2003, if I read that correctly. Is that right?
Not really, actually. 2015 is when I became super active. But of course, I have been involved since 1972, which is when my brother was born.
When your brother was born, yeah.
But my mom passed away in 2015, and that's when I was filled with anger, and that's when I was like, this can't be, and started to become very active in trying to implement some changes. But I was just thinking about one of the things you said right now around policy, and it's actually policy that defines disability as a problem. I mean, families like mine and like yours, disability just is. It's just part of who we are in our family life. It becomes problematic when policy defines it that way, and that's where, like, the Ontario Disability Support Program and other kinds of initiatives around disabilities start to run up against families, because we don't see it as a problem. We see it as our life, and we're trying to find ways to have a good life. Right.
Back to when I said 2003, I think I'm referring to stakeholder engagement. That's kind of work you've done since then.
I have always been doing stakeholder engagement kind of work.
Okay.
But my consulting practice happened because I had to give up full-time employment in order to care for my brother.
Right. So, the reason I say this is only because it seems like you've been doing this work for a very long time, longer than just 5 years. It seems like you've had an impact in this space for much longer, and you've certainly made a name and an impact in that very short period of time, and made it feel like it's been a longer period of time. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I wondered, talking about personal development, your own personal development, I wonder not just how much you've helped your brother or helped other people in this area, but how maybe you've grown and how you've changed in this time.
So I have changed enormously. I think that I have not always been a good advocate or understanding of the disability experience. So even though I say I've walked alongside my brother since 1972, I think a lot of times I haven't understood him, and it has a lot to do with having to do my own work around how I am with him and how I am in the world. And so there has been a lot of growth for me, especially in my relationship with my brother, trying to give him as much choice, to validate his choices, to validate his experiences, to listen and be patient, and to really understand his experience. And I don't think I've always done that. So, and I believe that I haven't arrived. I have much more work to do to profoundly understand him and other people with disabilities as well. And then as far as professional development goes, again, I'm always learning every time I come across a new organization that has a new idea that they're trying to implement, and they need my work as a program evaluator, helping them to implement the program as best possible, to evaluate it and justify it to the funders, and then looking at ways that we engage people and how can we. I'm so excited about this Ottawa Adult Autism Initiative because of just doing that work with these amazing people to create visually based surveys, to think about how we can engage a community of people who are not consulted, and to distinguish between who's saying that. Is it you, mother, who's saying that on behalf of your son or daughter, or is this really what your son and daughter are saying? And so, maybe that work is being done elsewhere. Like I say, my world is not necessarily as big as I wish it were. And so maybe that work is being done, but I think we owe it to people to ask people with disabilities, to ask them and to talk to them about how they see their needs, their supports, their services, their relationships with their family members.
I imagine that's pretty tricky. I mean, if you're trying to parse through, okay, who is this really coming from? Is this your thinking of what they think and feel, or is this what they actually think and feel? And you're having to negotiate between two different parties at once, and maybe just one who's representing the other. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, when you're trying to get to the nub of what someone actually thinks and feels, who's the subject of what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I just wonder, it sounds tricky, and how do you do it?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that's what we're figuring out, is how do you do it? And I think it's part of a culture change. I hope it's part of a culture change where it becomes the baseline, that's who you're talking to people and asking people for their opinions. And then, maybe over time there will be some best practices that'll evolve, or I don't like that word, so I'd like to not use that, but practices or ways of doing work where we are including people's voices that need to be heard.
Right.
Right. And maybe it doesn't look like the typical way that interviews or consultations have been done. Maybe it looks different, and we have yet to figure that out.
Yeah, and you're dealing with people who feel like they're owning the issue, so that if I'm representing someone, whether as the mother, the sibling, or the caregiver of a person with a disability, I feel like it's my duty to do the right thing and to represent them and to protect them from certain things in the world and to make sure that their voice is heard to a certain extent. And, it would be hard for me to hear that I'm not properly representing them. And so then, of course, the answer for me would be dialogue. But that takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. Time and patience for sure is and in a world dominated by billable hours, that's really hard to
necessarily afford, especially if you're working with grassroots organizations. And so I think that with parents, I see that with the work that I've been doing around sibling caregivers. So parents have expectations and hopes and ideas that they want their sons and daughters who may be doing the care to embody. But our journeys are so very different. And I think that maybe there needs to be more space for more voices generally, like including who are the potential people who are going to be involved in the lives of the person with a disability. And maybe it should be the person with a disability who chooses that. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done for sure.
You mentioned a little while ago that you don't think you've arrived, that you're still doing a lot of work for your own personal development. Do you think your mother ever arrived?
Oh, boy. My mother, I think that my mother and my father did the best that they could with what they had. So I'm going to say yes to that question. Because in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, there really wasn't a lot to draw on. And except for maybe some peer support, other parents. But even then, people were still pioneering. They were the first cohort, right? So there was not a lot. And I think there's a lot of stress inside some families, depending on the severity of disability or the finances or the context of the families. People don't maybe have access to the right kind of psychological support that they might need to help them through. So I think no. Well, I said yes, my parent, and then I say no, but I say yes, they did get there.
Yeah.
But they did that within the context of what they had access to.
Sure.
They didn't dedicate 24/7 to trying to figure it out, which, yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand. And certainly looking back, I mean, this is, a lot of what you're talking about is intellectual and developmental disability. With my mom, who had a physical disability, when she was disabled, it was 1968, very different time. And there was an expectation at that time that if you were that disabled, that you should go to an institution. That why would you live at home? It doesn't make any sense. You're no longer a part of normal society. And that the kind thing to do would be to send you away to an institution. Luckily, her parents didn't do that, and they made very different choices, and she had a much fuller, richer life, which is much more reflective of the time we now live in. But it's interesting when we're able to look back at 1968, 50 years ago, and see a different time. It's interesting now to ask ourselves the same question: how will we look at today in 2069, 2070? How will we see ourselves at that time? And it's impossible, obviously, to say, but it's an interesting thought experiment because it might actually shake ourselves out of the myopia that we might sometimes have.
That's a really exciting thought, actually, to think that far ahead. And that what you just said about your mother and the advice to go into an institution, that kind of ableist perspective is also what has been part of the sibling caregiving movement. So, it was always advised to parents that for the sake of your typically developed sibling, you should send your disabled son or daughter into institutional setting. And that would have been the case for my mother.
Why?
Well, it's that perspective that disability would bring, harm or delay or interruption to family. When in action.
No, I'm looking confused because I don't understand. But that doesn't make any sense. Like what?
Yeah, but it was practice. It was practice to recommend that for the sake of the typically developed child that you send your brother or sister away. So People First Canada has an amazing video about a sister, Maureen, talking to her brother Tim, who was sent away to an institution, and what she feels she missed in that relationship. And I can only imagine what you would miss because, of course, as I said earlier, siblings want to be involved, and of course, you want a relationship with your brother or sister.
Sure.
And but it was the perspective of the time, and even that even trickles down to why sibling caregiving is such a challenge. Because many of our parents have told us, "Don't worry, live your life. We'll find some solution. Just carry on with how you want to live your life." And then, lo and behold, there is no other solution. And you've been fed this narrative that you wouldn't have to do this caregiving journey, and then you are doing the caregiving journey. So a lot of siblings who are caring for their brother or sister with a disability are quite surprised to find themselves in the position that they're in, and so it happens sometimes suddenly, sometimes over a long period of time, with no resources, no control, no peer group, because unlike our parents, we haven't found each other yet. So the organization that I co-founded, the Sibling Collaborative, we're trying to do that. We're trying to pull peers together so that people can share their experiences and share their stories and feel like they have others that they can lean on.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like our parents, usually parents will find each other upon diagnosis, whereas brothers and sisters can wait up to 40 years before they try and seek out a peer. And just to go back to it quickly, this idea that you would be advised as parents to not have a developmentally or intellectually disabled person in the house for the sake of the other children. Mm-hmm. I can understand it just as an argument, put this person in an institution because it'll free up more time for you. It'll cost less money. It'll be easier in your home life. Mm-hmm. All of these, I can understand all of those things. Mm-hmm. I can understand the argument. Mm-hmm. But the argument that your other children would be better off doesn't hold any. It doesn't make any sense for me, and I'll tell you why. I would imagine, and I suspect, that you are a fuller, richer, more thoughtful, more empathetic person. You, Helen. Mm-hmm. Because you know your brother, because mm-hmm. you have a relationship with your brother. Mm-hmm. I just can't imagine that held you back in any way at any time, nor could it ever hold you back. Now, I'm not an expert in early childhood development. Maybe there's a doctor who would argue with me, but that just doesn't make any sense, and the evidence is right in front of me. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, you're right. I mean, I think that there was I would say that there was no evidence at the time that it made a difference. And many siblings that I've had the privilege of talking to, because with the work of the Sibling Collaborative, I have met many, many siblings, and we all say the same thing, that our brothers and sisters have taught us compassion, empathy, patience, and that we are fuller and richer for our experience. So it doesn't make any sense now looking back, but maybe that's that 50-year that 50-year thing that, maybe in 50 years from now we'll be saying something even more to challenge that even more. In fact, I did read an article even yesterday that came through around how having a brother or sister with an intellectual disability benefits children. So
I would imagine that if I had a child who went to school, for example, with other kids with a disability, that they would be better off as a result. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's my perspective of the world. But mm-hmm. Helen, I've got one more question for you before we finish off, which is that is there something that we haven't talked about that you wish we had? Was there one thing that if we had another hour to dig into it, you'd really want to address and get to the bottom of, even just out of curiosity? Is there something that you'd like to have a hack at? And you don't have to have a hack at it. You just have to throw it up in the air for next time.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many things. I'm not even sure where to throw my coin here. But a deeper dive on poverty and disability and the deep connection between the two of them. I think it's worth some more exploration. I also think it'd be very interesting to include a person with a disability in this kind of conversation. I think that's all I got.
No, that's great. I wanted to mention you did write an article about the connection between disability and poverty.
I did,
and I can reference that in the notes of this episode. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Helen, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for bringing me into your home, but for also illuminating this subject. It's both fascinating and there's an urgency to it that I really appreciate.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks.
To learn more about Helen Ries, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes as well as a way to get in touch with me. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other. You can also get the show notes about this episode and a couple of things in there that Helen sent to me after we had this discussion. Your quote of the week is from Helen Keller, and it goes, "When one door of happiness closes, another opens. But often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has just been opened for us." Thanks, as always, to our composer Andrea Wetstein for providing this wonderful music, and special thanks for this episode to Helen Ries of Ottawa, Ontario, for giving us her house in which to record. Next week, we're talking again with Barbara Bell, Artistic Director of the Kingston Writers Festival. I'll see you then.